Hello, hi, and welcome to Global Connections on ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm Patrick Bratton from Hawaii Pacific University. As I've done for a couple of times last month, I'm filling in for our normal host, Carlos Juarez, who is doing a Fulbright in Austria this spring semester. So Carlos, if you're watching, please, we say our warmest aloha to you from all of us at the ThinkTech team. We're very privileged today to have two wonderful guests, two people who I know very well. Serge Marek, who's a professor of geography at Hawaii Pacific University. He's going to be talking about a couple of things with you, particularly looking at indigenous urbanisms. And then later on, we'll have a guest from another HPU alum, Miina Houtari, who's originally from Finland, and is going to talk about Hawaii's increasing profile as a destination for international education. So what I'd like to do is get started with Serge and have Serge talk a little bit about himself and some of the interesting projects that he's been up to in the past couple of years. So, Serge, welcome to ThinkTech Hawaii.
Thank you so much for having me.
So you're a professor of geography at Hawaii Pacific University, correct?
That's correct, yeah.
In addition to doing geography in your research, which we'll get to in a second, you were involved with the Model UN Club. That had a pretty interesting visit to New York City recently?
Yes, we did. So I'm the faculty advisor for the United Nations Club at HPU. And every year we take a group of students ranging from 25 to, this year we took 13 students, to New York City, and they participate in the Model United Nations. It is an incredible experience. It's incredibly challenging for the students. They prepare for 6 months diligently and get there and have to perform for 3.5 days of very intensive negotiations. We were representing the Republic of Fiji this year, which was very exciting, and we had a fantastic meeting with the first secretary at the Republic of Fiji mission to the United Nations, and our students did a great job. We ended up getting a distinguished award, and all in all, it was a huge success.
Okay, I think we have a photo with some of the students there.
Yeah, I think we do.
At the Model UN. Okay, I think we'll show it in a little bit.
Yeah.
In terms of what the students do, I mean, Model UN is something that maybe people have heard about, but don't really know exactly what do they do. What do the students do?
Well, so we have to basically do exactly what the delegates from Fiji would have to do at the United Nations during a session. So our students are broken into different committees, and they representing different issues, lethal weapons, development, things like that. Usually it's 2 students per committee, and they have to work with other countries on resolutions. And they win points for coalition building, getting resolutions of large numbers of countries together, and eventually those resolutions get voted on. And the real success is if you're part of a resolution that gets voted through through committee at the end. They also have to present position papers before we leave. Those are very formalized arguments, basically based on Fiji's perspective on some issue, and they present those per committee as well. And sometimes they have to actually rewrite them on the spot. The other thing they have to do that can be quite challenging is get up and give speeches, trying to argue for agenda order initially and then argue for different resolutions. And those two, sometimes they have to write on the spot. They have maybe 10 minutes to put one of these together and then get up and give a speech. And it's often in front of 100 or more people.
Rather intimidating, right?
Yeah, that one takes a lot of practice, but our students did excellently this year, and a couple of them really kind of stood out, and we were very, very, very proud of them.
What are some things, I know it's kind of immediately after the fact of the event, but what are some things that the students tell you that they get out of it, or surprises, or things they learn about themselves, or the process of diplomacy?
Well, the most challenging thing is they have to be in character of the country that they're representing. And that can be very hard because not every country supports ideas that they necessarily support. And it's very easy to slip into your own opinions on a subject, whether it's on gay rights or women's rights or whatever, civil liberties, whatever. And the people that are sort of judging the delegates are watching for that. And one of the things that you get a lot of points for is staying in character. It's very tough. The other thing that's tough is that it's 12 to 13 and maybe even 14-hour days with a couple of breaks. And in that time, they have to stay in character, and they have to stay social, and they have to continue to negotiate, and that can be, well, it's exhausting, actually. Right. By the end, they are totally exhausted. So I think a skill that they get, some skills they get out of it, is this ability to push forward your idea, but also at the same time be willing to negotiate and compromise.
We've got the photo up now of some of the students. Just if you wanted to say anything about where they're at right now?
Yeah, well, this is at the Republic of Fiji mission to the United Nations, and in the middle is the Fiji First Secretary, and those are all of our delegates. And we had 2 Norwegians, a representative, one of our students was from Sweden, we had a student from Great Britain, from Australia, from Russia, a couple of local students, a couple of mainland students. So
interesting. So, I
mean, we were kind of a United Nations peacekeeping force.
Okay, interesting. I was going to say that almost like the HPU team was like a sort of mini UN.
We kind of were, yeah.
Kind of related to that, I mean, was there kind of interesting sort of culture class, perhaps is too strong of a word, but sort of different perspectives from, from the local perspective, mainland perspective, some of the international students when they got together on issues that you saw kind of diplomacy in action inside the group?
Well, there were, but that's what you have to get over that very quickly because you're representing Fiji's views. I think one of the seminal experiences we had this time was our meeting with the First Secretary, an amazing guy. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on his name. I think it was Jean Bai. Jean Bai is his name. And he really impressed upon us Fiji's views on international issues and also local issues in Fiji. And one of the things he really impressed upon us was the role Fiji has played in peacekeeping, despite being such a small country. And as I think he said punching above their weight. And in particular, that Fiji as a communal society really brings that into their peacekeeping effort. And it really had a profound impact on all of us. And it kind of catapulted our group into being very communal coalition building in their committees. And I think that won them a lot of points. We really were seen, our delegation was really seen as one that was really trying to bring large groups of countries together on the resolutions. And that was a great experience.
Interesting, interesting. What I always get back from the students that I interact is how much they get out of this experience. So it seems like quite a good one. What I wanted to do maybe is shift back back to you and your research. You've been working on a lot of issues dealing with the Maori community in New Zealand, and you started work on the Hawaiian community here in Hawaii. Can you maybe kind of give us a bit of a background of both how you got interested in sort of indigenous cultures within a sort of urban setting, and then tell us a bit about what research you're doing currently? Sure,
and I always begin any kind of discussion like this by noting that I am not of any indigenous group, haole through and through, and I certainly claim no authority, but anything I have brought to the table has been through working with wonderful people in the Maori community in particular, and really have been honored to work with them collaboratively and help sort of share some of their ideas and concepts and such. So the research I did most recently, and it's still ongoing, looked at ways in which the Maori, particularly in Auckland, Aotearoa, are turning the urban experience into something really positive for themselves. They are, there was a mass migration of Maori from about 10% urban before World War II to the most often quoted is 85% urban today. So in a very
85?
Well, it's a bit of a funky statistic. It has to do with the threshold that New Zealand has. 1,000 is urban in New Zealand, but nevertheless, a majority of Maori today live in cities in Aotearoa. And it has been a very challenging experience for them, and the typical narrative has been one of the challenge part, and famous movies like Once Were Warriors or things like that. Initially, I went down there thinking that that's more or less what I'd be looking at, and very quickly I started to recognize that there was another story that needed to be told, and it was one about the city becoming a place of opportunity, and one that didn't involve assimilation or acculturation, but instead really involved Maori asserting their worldview in an urban context, and one in which they were powerfully Maori and powerfully urban at the same time, and that wasn't a contradiction. So I initially went down thinking I was going to look at the impact that cities have had on Maori, and I think I came away recognizing that really what I was looking at was the impact that Maori are having on cities.
Okay, interesting. So total reversal in a sense
Yeah.
of your initial thoughts.
Yeah.
You know, to kind of help, you know, while there are a lot of cultural similarities we sometimes feel, you know, between Hawaii and New Zealand, I mean, to kind of, for kind of our people who are watching this show, I mean, what's some of the history that involves, so, you know, we're all pretty aware that, you know, there were Polynesian people and Maori there before Europeans came in. There's a treaty that was originally signed 19th century that still governs.
Treaty of Waitangi. Yeah.
Which could you give us a little more information about that?
Well, Treaty of Waitangi is really the backbone of the bicultural politics of Aotearoa, and I think most Maori would agree that it has its flaws in its interpretation and its in translation and how it's been exercised politically, and yet I think in its ideal it's quite something to be quite proud of, and it has really helped Maori Pakeha relationships sort of establish some sort of meaningful biculturalism. Certainly not perfect in my understanding of it, although that was not the main focus of my research per se.
Okay, thank you. We're going to take a short break right now, and then we'll be back and we'll talk, get a little bit more into detail with a lot of the work that you're doing.
Okay, very good.
Inspired by an ancient culture, classical Chinese dance, vigorous physicality, timeless stories, 5,000 years of Chinese music and dance. Shen Yun presents authentic Chinese culture. Coming to Blaisdell Concert Hall, May 8th and 9th. Tickets at shenyun.com or call 808-792-3919.
Hi, I'm Jay Fidel. That's Ted Ralston. You know, Ted is the host of Where the Road Leads. It shows every Friday from 4 to 5 p.m. It's about technology. It's about how people collaborating and solve problems with modern technology. It's where the road leads. We all know that. We should all be listening. Join us there, 4 to 5 p.m. every Friday. Now, what about that do you agree with?
All of it.
I knew he'd say that. Aloha. Say aloha.
Aloha.
Good.
Hello, we're back. We're Global Connections on ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm Patrick Bratton, filling in for Carlos Juarez, our normal host, who's doing a Fulbright in Austria. So my special guest today is Dr. Serge Marek, who's talking about both Indigenous urbanisms in New Zealand and also Indigenous urbanisms in Hawaii. Before we get back to your research, we actually, from our Twitter feed, because we're very social media oriented here at ThinkTech, we've got a couple of questions that some people were interested in. So from the exact question here is, how do you think Indigenous communities are especially affected by things such as minimum wage, cost of living, more urban development in the name of tourism in Hawaii or New Zealand?
Well, it's a great question. I think that it really speaks to the challenge part of the urbanization process. You know, cities are forceful things, and they are, you know, concrete steel jungles, and they represent, in many ways, a kind of sort of most profound representation of a Western geography being implanted in a place that certainly had very different geographic focus. Although I have to say this isn't the focus of my research, I think that this is a discourse that has dominated, that it has been a place where it has been a struggle for Indigenous people. And I really tried to assert that I think something else is going on, and that while we need to recognize the struggle, I think we also need to recognize the successes that are occurring. In that, in this question, I think they struggle as much as people that are struggling in cities do across the board. I'm not sure it is necessarily singularly unique. I think it represents the struggle of poverty and urban industrial capitalism that I think a lot of groups struggle from. But again, I like to focus on another aspect of this, which is finding ways to bring Indigenous worldviews and Indigenous geographies, since that's my disciplinary focus, into an urban context. And I would argue that doing so is absolutely critical to perhaps trying to reverse some of those trends.
Interesting. So one of the things, that, at least my understanding is that you focused on is the role of these special places within cities, these marae. Is that's the correct term?
Marae, yeah.
Right. And so you've done a lot of work visiting, talking with people. I think we actually have some of your photos of one of these marae in Auckland, I do believe.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, that is Ngawai o Horotio Marae at the Auckland University of Technology campus.
Mm-hmm.
A trend that has been going on for several decades has been universities in Aotearoa building maraes, and I spent some time on several, the University of Auckland marae, the Unitech marae, and this one I actually took language classes in and spent some time on. The really incredible thing about the marae, just as part of Maori culture, in fact, you cannot understand Maori culture probably without fully understanding marae, and I'm certainly not an expert, but I was fascinated with the urban marae because one of the things that came with Maori migration to cities was the building of marae. At first in informal settings, but
mm-hmm.
over time much more formally. The tangata whenua, the iwi that would claim parts of cities will have their marae,
mm-hmm.
and then there are other types of maraes as well. And they're just incredibly profound spaces. And to me, this picture in particular, one of the things that's so striking is how the Maori have been able to really claim a space, a sacred space, that has continuity going back across their whakapapa deep into their ancestry, and have that juxtaposed against, urban industrial capitalist space.
Mm-hmm.
I had to come up with a term to try to describe these, and the term I came up with was inviolate spaces, inviolate meaning free from harm or violence. And I think more than any other urban built environment I've ever come across, they've become these places that are really untouched, will not be touched by the forces of capitalism. I don't think anyone would dare in Aotearoa to try to knock one of these down anymore. It's happened in the past.
Mm-hmm.
But today they've become these very powerful anchors for Maori urban culture. And opening out to become part of, I think, Aotearoa identity beyond just the Maori. The AUT marae is a very, it has a multi-ethnic component to it in its carvings and in its orientation about introducing people to Maori culture. So it speaks to one of the fundamental theoretical or maybe even ontological elements of my argument, which is that, any social movement to be fully successful has to be equally a spatial movement. Cultures need to claim space, and that in order to fully put forward their worldviews and their values and such.
Would you say that's perhaps, you and I debate globalization all the time, would you say that that's perhaps an aspect that some people would like to overlook? When we think about globalization, we think about, well, space doesn't matter, distance doesn't matter anymore, you could just put it on the internet, or something like that. Would you say, perhaps against that discourse, that space, geographic space in this sense, remains vitally important for these movements?
Absolutely, yeah, that's central to my argument. Although, there's very interesting things going on with the Maori. Maori TV has become sort of the best TV in Aotearoa, and they have this wonderful poster, enter this space. But it's a sort of a cyberspace, if
right.
you will. It's a media space where they're producing incredible content, mostly in Maori, often with English subtitles, but also really wonderful TV programs and such. And so I think they're occupying cyberspace as well. So I don't think it's fully necessarily has to only deterministically be anchored in physical space, but that's absolutely critical that it also has that, I would argue.
Interesting, interesting. One of the things I was kind of curious about when we were talking is, when we were talking before the interview, I'd mentioned the concept of sanctuary. And then when we were talking about marae, that was something for you that you weren't comfortable with that term. And I was intrigued if you could maybe share with our viewers why you preferred inviolate versus sanctuary.
Yeah, I thought about that conversation a little bit since we had it. And what I came to was that, on the one hand, I think you can make a sanctuary argument. I think a lot of people go to the marae space, particularly Maori, and do find it as a place to retreat from the kind of chaos of urban society, if you will, as anyone might want to. But the reason I somewhat objected to that term was it had a sense of retreat, a sense of walled inness, a way to escape. And I think that the direction, the Maori that I certainly have been doing my research with, the direction that they're going is being able to not have to build walls and retreat. They can now move forward, because I really believe that for some Maori, they are reaching a point where they are moving beyond the legacy of colonialism. And I know that's going to be a controversial thing to say, but they are reaching a point of empowerment where they don't have to concern themselves with that on a daily basis, that they can now start to focus on just being productive culturally, and speaking in a very powerful way to what the city should be. And I think that the ability for the marae to sort of become an open space, there are marae being constructed that have museums connected to them and have cafeterias where the public can go. And that's a new phase, and it really speaks to, I think, a confidence, a cultural confidence, that we don't have to completely protect this space anymore as a way to resist, but we can move beyond resistance now. And what does come after resistance, right? If you've conquered that to some extent, then what's the next phase? And I think that that's what's so exciting, particularly, and I think the Maori have really led the way in this, but I think it's happening all over the world. It's happening in the First Nation peoples of Canada, I think in the United States, the Native Americans in places, this is happening. Aboriginals are doing this in Australia. I've read articles about the Mapuche in Chile, beginning to kind of claim urban space as well. So it's not isolated to Aotearoa.
I want to pick up on that, particularly a phrase that you mentioned that I liked, sort of having a claim on how the city should be. And one of the things that's interesting about your research is that not just doing it in New Zealand now, you're looking at Hawaii. And I wonder if you could kind of speak about some of where your research is going in Hawaii in terms of urban spaces and, in terms of looking at how things are shaping that way.
So in its nascent stages, but where I'm headed is a comparative study of Hawaiian urbanisms and Maori urbanisms. And I'm particularly interested in the work that Kamehameha Schools Bishop Estate is doing in Kaka'ako with their redevelopment plan. I can only speak to it in very general terms because I haven't made the proper connections with Kamehameha Schools in order to feel comfortable talking about it at a deeper level. But I think it really speaks to certainly a Hawaiian institution or organization that has this opportunity to create what I call indigenous urban placemaking. And you go to their website and they talk about how they want to bring Hawaiian values, cultural values into this redevelopment project. And to me, that immediately speaks of some of the stuff that's going on in Aotearoa as well. In fact, as this comparative research develops, there is an iwi out in Auckland, Ngāti Whātua, Orake, who has a large tract of land in downtown, very similar to the Kaka'ako land that Kamehameha Schools has. And they both are struggling with, what do you do with this land once you have it? Does it just become a revenue stream, or is there a way to really bring in Maori or Hawaiian values into the urban context? And I think Kamehameha Schools is really trying to do that, and so I think it's really quite fascinating, and I think it speaks again to this next phase where the urban is no longer just a challenge, but becomes a place of opportunity.
Interesting. Well, what I think we'll have to do is have you back on the show as you get a lot of more research done both over there and here, and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
All right. Well, thank you very much. We'll take a short break again, and we'll be right back with our other guest. And again, we're Global Connections on ThinkTech Hawaii.
I'm Donna Blanchard, and this is your daily ThinkTech news for Thursday, April 2nd, 2015. In a joint news conference in Lausanne, Switzerland this morning, Iran and the world powers gathered there announced that they had reached a surprisingly specific and comprehensive general understanding about the next steps in limiting Tehran's nuclear program. President Obama spoke from the White House in a separate news conference, saying the deal cuts off every pathway for Iran to develop a nuclear weapon and that it establishes the most intrusive inspection system in history. If Iran cheats, the world will know it, he said. Secretary of State John Kerry sought to cut off concerns about the duration of the arrangement by insisting in his news conference that some elements of the agreement, quote, will never expire. This framework will be filled in with details before the final agreement to be made in June. No sanctions will be lifted against Iran until that final agreement is approved by Congress. In Kenya, Somalia's al-Qaeda-linked Shabib group claimed responsibility for attacking a college campus in the town of Garissa, killing at least 147 people. The masked men reportedly singled out Christian students, separating them from their Muslim peers before murdering them. 79 more students have been injured. And Kenya's National Disaster Operations Center later tweeted that, quote, the operation in Garissa University College has ended with all 4 terrorists killed. An al-Shabaab spokesman told AFP news agency by telephone that the attack was revenge for Nairobi troops fighting in Somalia. He said, Kenya is at war with Somalia. Our people are still there, they are fighting, and their mission is to kill those who are against the Shabib. Nigeria's president-elect Muhammadu Buhari has already spoken strongly against what he called 2 scourges in this giant democracy, the ruthless onslaught of the Boko Haram militant group and the evil of corruption. It was during his acceptance speech in the midst of what has been a very peaceful passing of power after this week's election and President Goodluck Jonathan's graceful concession that Mr. Buhari seemed to be setting his agenda for the coming months. Mr. Buhari is a former general who once rose to power in a military coup and is known to rule with an iron fist. The Honolulu Museum of Art has turned over 7 pieces of art to authorities because they had been either purchased from or donated by an art thief. Suhash Kapoor has long-term relationships with people in the art world and sold and donated antiquities to the museum. He was arrested in 2011 and is awaiting trial in India. Authorities received a tip on 1 piece of art at the museum, and an investigation uncovered 6 more stolen pieces. The special agent in charge, Wayne Willis, told Hawaii News Now that since 2007, there have been 7,800 pieces, cultural antiquities, that have been seized and repatriated to governments or countries. The 7 items will be stored as evidence in New York, then returned to India once the case is closed. I'm Donna Blanchard, and this has been your daily ThinkTech News for Thursday, April 2nd, 2015. Ahui ho.
Hello, we're Global Connections on ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm Patrick Bratton, in for Carlos Juarez. So we've just got done with a fascinating conversation about indigenous urbanisms. Now we're going to shift focus a little bit talking about international education in Hawaii. So I'm very lucky to be joined by our guest, Miina Houtari, who's originally from Finland, and she was an HPU alum and also a student of mine, and some of the best classes you took, right?
Sure, yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
very
absolutely,
good.
absolutely. Mhm.
Excellent. So Miina, tell me a little bit about yourself. So you're from Finland. How did you get all the way from Finland to Hawaii?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here today. So I came to Hawaii about 4 years ago to study at HPU, and I had to stop in Hawaii because I couldn't go any further. I'm literally on the other side of the world right now. To be serious, I was looking for college education in an international environment to get my degree in English as I was seeking for international opportunities and an international-based career. And that is what really brought me to Hawaii. And I learned about HBU, and I learned about the great opportunities in a multicultural student environment with professors from different places with different experiences. And I decided to give it a try, and now this has become my home, and I really wanted to stay after graduating, and I'm still here.
Interesting. During your studies, then beyond your studies, did you have a particular focus or regions of the world or issues that really you were passionate about?
Well, during my first year, I was still kind of looking for my interest and special interest, and what really inspired me was development-related issues, especially socioeconomic issues, human rights, and political and economic development issues, mainly in sub-Saharan Africa. But I also have development interest in my later years, during my senior year and during my year now working in Hawaii to Asia Pacific related issues and relations.
Okay, interesting. So you've mentioned, I mean, you graduated a couple of years ago, so you've been in Hawaii working. My understanding is you're very engaged in sort of community activism and nonprofits here in Hawaii. I mean, could you give us kind of a little overview of some of the things you've been doing?
So I actually graduated last year, so 2014. Time flies by. But after that, I was looking into my opportunities. And during my years in college, I realized that Hawaii is a small place, but it's actually a great place to create great connections and have great opportunities to proceed with career ambitions and things like that. And I actually ended up working last summer for a nonprofit organization called Face Hawaii, which is focused on social justice related issues. So I was working for that organization until I was fortunate enough to start working for my alma mater at HPU. And I'm working closely with our international students because I feel like I had a great experience at HPU and in Hawaii, and I want to make sure that our students know what the opportunities are out here. Even though it's a small community, it is large enough and connected enough in terms of the rest of the world to really get good advancement after college and during college towards future career aspirations and so forth.
Okay. Well, I mean, what are some of these opportunities? Because as you well know, I mean, oftentimes when people outside of Hawaii, even in the rest of the United States, look at Hawaii, and the first thing that comes to mind is tourism. You know, Waikiki, aloha shirts, and bad luau's, and all sorts of things like this. It's sometimes hard, or it's a challenge we have often working in education in Hawaii, to sort of tell people, no, this is a place, there are universities here, there are think techs here, there are NGOs here, there's lots of things going on sort of away from Waikiki Beach, if you will. What are some of these opportunities that maybe people, both students and people actually even here in Hawaii might not know about?
Well, I think, first of all, as a student, you come to a global learning community in Hawaii, and you come to a community where people are either from here, people are from Asia, from the mainland, from Latin America, from Africa, from Europe. We come here. It is not for no reason that Oahu is called a gathering place. It really is a gathering place, and we have people from all over the world, and it really gives this good opportunity to create tolerance amongst us and create people who leave Hawaii often come back because of that atmosphere that we have for some reason created here due to the interconnectedness of Hawaii and kind of being in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It creates us the great place for business, for science, for culture, for international relations and related fields. And it really gives the opportunity for the students to be imposed or exposed to those different variations of exposure of different cultures and different ideas and different values. And besides, like you mentioned, there are different think tanks and different opportunities for students to be engaged while still in college. And taking the demands from the job market and the work field in the current world, pretty much anywhere you go, if you have a college degree, that's not simply enough anymore. So you do need the practical experience when you're entering the whatever field students are looking at. And I can't emphasize enough the fact that Hawaii, being small, it still has these great connections and great opportunities for students for internships, to shadow a business leader or go and grab a lunch and have someone from the financial district who's a manager for a company behind you in the lunch line. So that really creates the great opportunity for students and recent graduates to connect with people from different businesses.
If you don't mind me putting on the spot for a moment, could you perhaps, if you have a personal example of this, when you came to Hawaii and then maybe you were interacting with people from a different culture or a different perspective, and then that sort of, if you will, elucidated this idea for you about the role that Hawaii can play, if you had a sort of a personal anecdote?
I think I would look back to my very first semester here. I was afraid because English was not my first language, and it still is not. There are people from different circumstances here, but there's still this understanding of the diversity, and there's this welcoming feel that really makes you feel that you are safe here and you are able to try those new things and find you and find the community here. But also coming from a different country to Hawaii and to the United States, it can be a culture shock. But those opportunities that I mentioned before, they don't necessarily come to knock on your door. You kind of have to be there. But I think personally my experience while studying at HBU was that the community is built in a way where faculty and staff are very well connected in the community, and they also help to provide those opportunities for students. Dr. Marek gave a good example of the Model United Nations Club, and I was actually part of the club for 3 years. My whole college career, I was part of the club, and I ended up going to the conference 3 times, and that really helped me to not only create connections here and get that experience and that practice diplomacy in the real world, sort of, but also get connections while in the conference, because you can meet very important people over there. So depending on what your interest is, and oftentimes the club has this stigma that it's only for students who study political science and international relations, but we had students from nursing, from business, from environmental studies, because the United Nations covers all those topics. So there's everything for everyone. I think the community also here in Hawaii encourages for engagement, and there's room for engagement. And if students would know more about those opportunities and had the courage to step forward and say, I would really like to advance my future career preparation by doing an internship. I personally did an internship at Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard's office for about 8 months during my senior year, and it was definitely one of the best experiences I've ever had. When I was a little kid, I would have never imagined that I would be interning for a U.S. Congresswoman in Hawaii. But like you mentioned before, there is definitely this idea, Hawaii, of being only a tourist destination. But obviously, it was a very huge plus for me when I was first coming here. I was looking for something that would give me a quality education, a place where I wouldn't have to suffer a 10-month winter like I do in my dear homeland. But how do we get rid of that? How do we not necessarily get rid of that by including the soul of Hawaii and the warm aloha and the warm weather, but also I've been trying to think how to make the switch in terms of thinking about Hawaii as a serious educational destination, not only as a tourist destination. I think there was a few weeks ago, there was a talk by the Consul General of the United Arab Emirates here visiting in Hawaii, where you also were present. We heard that people don't necessarily think Hawaii as an educational destination. But how do we change that? How do we make sure that people understand that this is actually a great place and a great educational opportunity to study business, to study science, to study international relations? And Hawaii as a location where everybody comes together, and there's a lot of military presence, there's a lot of presence for diplomacy, there's a lot of presence for business, global market evolves around the Pacific. So how do we make sure that we deliver that message? That's a great strategic question to figure out, I think, for Hawaii and also to individuals on this island.
I want to ask you about that question, but I want to ask you maybe a smaller bit of that question first. One of the challenges that I note personally is that while we do have many sort of separate institutions, universities, and so on in Hawaii, oftentimes we have an emphasis in the institution of looking outward. We look outward, we're going to bring people here to Hawaii, or we're going to send our people in Hawaii out to the mainland internationally. But surprisingly, we often don't have very good connections on island between people who are doing things much in the same way. Is that also your read, that we could perhaps do a better job coordinating and having a synergy effect between ourselves, or consortium effect, or whatever you would like to call it, that might be a way of sort of dealing with these challenges?
Absolutely. I think we need to work as a community, and we need to work for a common good for all of us. I currently work in the recruitment field and in the admission field, and I've noticed that oftentimes there is this tendency to think about things as individual pieces. But as a state and as a community, I think we need to start thinking more broadly about international education in general. There are different factors that we can think about, and it is not only an institutional effort issue or a challenge. It is a community issue. I think it was, according to some measures in 2011, there were about 5,000 international students in Hawaii.
5,000?
Who brought about $115 million in in revenue for the state. And that is really not nothing. And
That's significant.
It is absolutely. And it is international students, not only do they bring the multicultural aspect to the island and to the communities, to the smaller communities and to the institutions, but they also can help bring tax revenue. They can help bring jobs. They can help bring permanent daily spending to the state. So this is not only a benefit for individual institutions to promote international education, but it also a benefit for the state, for the communities, and for all organizations on the island to create that diversity. So I think we do need efforts from individuals, from staff members across the state, but also from advocacy groups from the state of Hawaii, from our federal representatives in the Congress and in the Senate. And I think we need to change our mindset a little bit about thinking international education and thinking it more like as a common effort rather than individuals just trying to find how to put the pieces together.
Yeah, I'm biased, but I totally agree with that. It's one of the issues that I've constantly found. If you're thinking about ways that people could kind of move forward, so we've identified the problem, we're thinking about some things that we could do. I mean, are there a couple of things that you might suggest or draw attention to people, whether it's efforts from, whether it's the Pacific and Asian Affairs Council and citizen diplomacy or the State Department Visitors Program or any other initiatives or things that you might want to raise a little awareness for our audience here at ThinkTech?
I think the most important thing is to recognize the culture here and recognize the market that we're looking at and think about in those terms. This is not like, oh, we're putting an advertisement in the TV and like buy and you're gonna get this and that. But it's more like an approach and relationship building. It's more like making those connections in the community, and by creating those connections within organizations, within these think tanks, it's kind of like thinking about a long-term solution rather than thinking it as a how do we promote Hawaii right now? How do we promote us as a educational destination? But more so, creating those relationships. And every single person who leaves Hawaii is an ambassador to Hawaii. And when I go home and people ask me questions like, so is it a real world? Is it even, what do you do there? Do you just go and surf? I think those individual conversations are the starting point where all of us can do better when we go to our home countries, when we go to different cities, different places, are the individual conversations, how we convey the message, what is Hawaii like? Because what normally people think are the beaches and the palm trees, and possibly the business side of it.
So, international education, Hawaii, maybe I'll put this back to you as we're drawing to a close here. What's next for Miina? What is Miina going to be doing in the immediate future?
That is a great question. I'm always open for new spontaneous moves, but I have something in the works. In the long term, I am hoping to one day go back to Finland, possibly work for the foreign ministry of Finland, and hopefully create an international career of some sort. But I am still open to be inspired. Let's just put it that way.
Okay, excellent. Yeah. Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure talking with you again. All right. In closing, Patrick Bratton for Global Connections and ThinkTech Hawaii. We'll have more guests for you next week. And again, Carlos Juarez, we wish you hello and a good aloha here from Hawaii, and hope you're having a good time, and save me some Wiener Schnitzel and some beer while you're there in Austria. And thank you. We're Global Connections, ThinkTech Hawaii.